Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring you today's most pressing issues from across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. With Donald Trump's return to the White House, the world is bracing for big changes to the global landscape. As for the Korean Peninsula, all eyes are on whether the American leader's policies on North Korea's denuclearization remain solid. Following his inauguration, Trump referred to North Korea as a nuclear power and spoke about his positive relationship with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. He also emphasized that he and Kim got along well, expressing confidence that Kim would be pleased with his return to the Oval Office. Now, following a period of high-stakes diplomacy and direct engagement with North Korea during his first term, experts are closely watching whether Trump's approach will evolve or face new challenges given shifting regional and global dynamics. Today, we explore what lies ahead for U.S. policy in dealing with North Korea and its broader implications for the global security. And for this, we invite Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Welcome, Dr. Cronin.
Thank you.
And also joining us is Brian Myers, Professor of International Studies at Dongsa University. Thank you for coming on, Professor.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So let's start a discussion with Dr. Cronin. During his first term, like I said, President Trump's approach to North Korea was marked by high-stakes diplomacy and direct engagement with Kim Jong-un. Do you think this style of engagement would prove effective again, or do you foresee new challenges given the current situation in his second term?
Well, I don't think maximum pressure will be the initial approach of the second Trump administration towards North Korea. But I do think direct engagement is still the style that President Trump prefers. And every indication is here on even day 3 of his administration, this second term, is that he's essentially hinted at an invitation for re-engagement with leader Kim Jong-un. You've already referred to the nuclear power comment. The indication that he has a good rapport with Kim Jong-un. He inquired about his health, said he was concerned about his well-being. All of those would suggest that Trump wants to re-engage with the North Korean leader. And he has now a special missions envoy in Rick Grenell. He has a Secretary of State in place who's interested in North Korea. He has a Deputy National Security Advisor in Alex Wong who's used to back channels. So there are lines of communication that seem to be already opening.
Mm-hmm. U.S. Secretary of State nominee Marco Rubio recently acknowledged the failure of sanctions in curbing North Korea's nuclear development and emphasized the need for a new approach. And Dr. Cronin just mentioned maximum pressure won't be happening again. Professor Myers, what about you? How do you gauge the potential for a drastic shift in Washington's policies?
Yeah, I kind of agree with Dr. Cronin. I see a lot of potential there. Donald Trump and the U.S. foreign policy establishment, the so-called blob or deep state, they disagree about a lot of countries. But when it comes to North Korea, they see pretty much eye to eye. The State Department has kind of always advocated a soft line approach to North Korea. So during Trump's first term, it supported his outreach to Pyongyang. It was, in fact, urging him to make bolder concessions to Kim Jong-un than the National Security Council wanted Trump to make. Of course, in the end, the Hanoi summit fell apart 6 years ago, but both Trump and the State Department, I think, remain very optimistic that a settlement can be reached. The problem, as I see it, of course, is Ukraine. I don't see how Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un can negotiate a deal so long as North Korean soldiers are still fighting with the Russians against Ukraine. And I think the American public considers an end to that war to be much more urgent than a peace settlement with Kim Jong-un.
Right. So we'll touch upon the Ukraine issue as we speak. But let's circle back to the nuclear power statement by Trump. Professor, U.S. President Trump described North Korea as a nuclear power on Inauguration Day, and this comes after controversy has spurred over similar remarks by his Defense Secretary nominee, Pete Hegseth. Though this differs from the term nuclear armed state, this remark sparked controversy over a potential shift in Washington's stance on the non-proliferation treaty. What are the chances?
Well, again, the U.S. foreign policy elite has been saying for years now in op-ed pieces in major newspapers that it's time to come to terms with North Korea's nuclear capability. The sanctions aren't working. We need to live with it. So if Trump and his team are now striking the same notes, I think that raises the likelihood of some sort of arrangement being reached, perhaps one couched in terms that would save face for the United States, say by allowing for very rigorous inspections and verifications, or by laying out a plan for a very gradual disarmament. I would agree with Dr. Cronin that it would be very difficult for America formally to recognize North Korea as a nuclear state. A few other countries, though, have nuclearized outside the NPT framework, like India and Israel. The problem with North Korea is that it's an enemy of the United States who has nuclearized. So I think any sort of settlement would have to be reached in the context of a very dramatic change in the entire relationship between the two countries. And I'm skeptical, but Donald Trump loves a challenge. And I think once the Ukraine issue is resolved, North Korea could well become one of his top foreign policy priorities.
Right, so we'll have to really see what happens after this Ukraine issue is resolved. Now, what about you, Dr. Cronin? Some people say that Trump may want to seek a small deal with North Korea, which means a freeze of its nuclear programs in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. How likely is this scenario?
Well, we're sort of jumping out to an end state that is somewhat fantastical at this point. I think we have to start and restart negotiations first. I think neither President Trump nor Kim Jong-un is particularly interested in small deals. At least they wouldn't sell it that way. So while I agree with everything Professor Myers said, and I agree with what Ambassador Detrani said earlier, in terms of talking about the idea of a fissile freeze, material freeze, as being a kind of a small step that could be a significant step in U.S.-North Korean relations. I just don't think the negotiations will start off with this. I think this could be a first step of a product of negotiation, and maybe it gets stalled at that point, or maybe that's as far as they can go. But I don't think small deals is sort of what Trump is thinking about. He may delegate this, though, to his administration to say, if you can negotiate a way to contain the North Korean issue so I can get on with my U.S.-China contest, I could see him doing that. So we'll have to see whether a small deal is the result of an engagement. But first, we have to get through the engagement. We have to re-engage, and that's really what's on the table right now.
Right, resuming talks actually is pretty much difficult and important at this point. Now, Professor Myers, how do you see chances of Trump jumping on North Korean issues during his first few months? You mentioned Ukraine a while ago. How much of a priority do you think the denuclearization issue would be?
Well, there's this very weird logic in American media and think tanks for the past few years, according to which America shouldn't really worry much about Russia's nuclear weapons because Putin wouldn't dare to attack America no matter what America does to Russia through its Ukrainian proxy. But the danger of North Korea launching a nuclear strike out of the blue is so great, we've just got to start negotiating with Kim Jong-un as soon as possible. And that's never made much sense to me. And it won't make much sense, I think, either to the American people or to Donald Trump. He's going to want to wrap up that proxy war first if he really is worried about the risk of a nuclear war. And that will likely take months. Besides which, this is an America First president for whom domestic problems are bound to take precedence for a while. Plus, Kim Jong-un doesn't want to come running, at America's first call. He's going to want to play hard to get for a while. So I would be very surprised if negotiations were even attempted before this summer.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about from North Korea's perspective, Dr. Cronin? Given Trump's history of direct engagement with Kim, do you believe North Korea would be willing to return to the negotiating table under the second administration? And what factors would influence the regime's decision to engage diplomatically with the U.S. again?
Well, I think in principle, Kim Jong-un should want to probe what President Trump is willing to do, including what he means by nuclear power. But as Professor Myers pointed out, there are some significant obstacles in the way this first half of 2025. And I agree, the Russia-Ukraine negotiations, whatever happens on that war, is really of paramount importance. And until that's cleared, it's hard to imagine the North Korean negotiation being really ripe for talks. But it really does come down to Kim Jong-un being interested. He spurned the Biden and Yoon administrations on diplomacy. Clearly, Trump is a different flavor, and maybe the South Korean government that could be coming and changing in this year would also open up the prospects that would invite diplomacy in the latter half of 2025.
Mm-hmm. Now, South Korea had been concerned about not being involved in the decision-making process if Trump's move forward with this direct engagement strategy with North Korea, Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un agrees to do that. Now, since Seoul currently has a leadership vacancy, as we all know, with the ongoing impeachment trial against President Yoon Suk-yeol, what can it do to ensure its interests are protected, Professor Myers?
Well, South Koreans are, of course, right to worry. We know that Donald Trump generally believes that the South Koreans can and should defend themselves. So I don't think he's going to let concern for South Korea's security get in the way of a deal that he thinks is going to be really great for the United States. Now, Donald Trump did not get along very well with President Moon Jae-in during his first term, but there had been hopes here in South Korea that he might bond a little bit better with President Yoon, perhaps on the golf course. The two men both play golf. That's obviously not going to happen, at least not in the short term. On the other hand, again, it will likely be summer or at least, maybe even autumn or winter before Trump can really turn his attention to North Korea. And by that time, I'm sure we all hope, that this current leadership crisis will have been resolved some way or another. And whoever is leading South Korea then, I'm sure, will advocate actively for this country's interests with the White House.
Right, so we'll have to hope for the turmoil to end before Trump focuses on this denuclearization issue. Now, North Korea's state media on Friday reported on the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol's detention by the South Korea's anti-corruption agency on the martial law imposition. Now, since November, the regime has often been updating its people on the situation here in South Korea, especially on the anti-Yoon rallies. Professor, how would you read into this? Aren't they supposed to be concerned about their public being shocked over, democratic activities of South Korean citizens?
I don't think so, Mok-yeon. The North Koreans have been seeing photographs and footage of demonstrating South Koreans for the past 40 or 50 years. They were fully informed about the impeachment of Park Geun-hye. And if that didn't have a subversive effect on public opinion in the North, the news of President Yoon's detention is not likely to shake them up very much either. What you and I may regard as signs of a robust, pluralist democracy at work, as a display of free speech, are seen in the context of North Korea's culture as evidence of a really disgraceful chaos and disunity. And that, in turn, is seen as the result of a leader failing to command love and respect the way that Kim Jong-un does. When you talk to older North Korean refugees and you ask them how they reacted to this kind of news when they were up there, they'll tell you that the subversive effect came more from seeing how well-dressed people were, how nice the buildings in Seoul looked. But the regime now chooses its images quite carefully. So I don't think this is going to have much of a subversive or destabilizing effect on North Korean public opinion at all.
Mm-hmm. Now, in a recent report, Kim Jong-un reportedly sent a New Year's letter to encourage and express gratitude to its troops deployed to fight for Russia in its war against Ukraine. Dr. Cronin, how much longer do you think this troop support for Russia would continue by North Korea?
Well, I think Kim Jong-un really prizes this new revitalized alliance with Russia. This is providing new revenue streams for him, new prestige, power and leverage he can use with China, the United States, and others. Every indication is that he's willing to send in, or is already in the pipeline of sending in, another 10,000 troops to fight in Russia's war against Ukraine. So I think as long as that fight is going on, Kim Jong-un is going to use this new relationship with Russia to the max. And we'll have to see whether diplomacy starts to lead to a ceasefire and the troops start to come home. But at this point, commercial overhead imagery, for instance, shows on a regular basis that there's active port activity of trade on energy and potentially arms going back and forth between Russia and North Korea. So this is a strong relationship at the moment, and I expect Kim Jong-un to use it because it is leverage for him for when he does re-engage with the United States or when he does engage China. This factor really provides him that kind of balance of power that he seeks.
Right, so we're seeing thousands of people going to Ukraine, and I just want to ask if North Korea really has more room for resources to do that.
Well, they have troops, and they can send troops, and they're under Russian command, and the Russians are using them with changing their tactics day by day, depending on how they see the interaction of the fighting, apparently. Right now, the Russians may have pulled them back a bit, but that's only because they're waiting to assess maybe the diplomacy, if there is diplomacy, with the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. So we'll have to see how that goes. Now, meanwhile, in another news, South Korea has announced the development of a low-altitude missile defense system akin to Israel's Iron Dome to better counter North Korea's long-range artillery threats. Professor Myers, what's the background behind this development, and what could this latest technology be capable of?
Well, there's been talk of the need for something like this for quite some time, and the South Koreans have looked kind of enviously at Israel's famous Iron Dome. So what is planned here is also a kind of ground-based surface-to-air system that would use radar to detect incoming rockets and artillery and fire missiles to intercept or attack them. Now, this won't be cheap, of course, and while the Americans did much of the funding for Israel's Iron Dome, I think the burden for South Korea's version of it is going to fall squarely on the taxpayers here. And yet, I think developing such a system makes good sense for a country, half of whose population is within the range, even of quite short-range North Korean artillery. Of course, such a dome would never be foolproof. These systems are vulnerable to saturation strikes, for example. But I think it would be a step in the right direction. And the present time is a bit like the 1970s in South Korea, in that the Americans, the alliance is not as reliable as it might have looked at other times. And I think the South Koreans do need to start taking more of their defense into their own hands. And this is, a step in the right direction.
Right, then it's a good news for South Korea. Well, as North Korea continues to enhance its missile capabilities and cyber warfare abilities, Dr. Cronin, how do you assess the effectiveness of current international sanctions and diplomatic efforts to contain these advancements?
Well, not that effective based on North Korea's results, but that's mostly because the Russia and China support at the UN Security Council is no longer a factor, and Kim Jong-un has broken that regime. And as a result, it makes it a lot easier for North Korea to get, obviously, not just from China, but from Russia in particular right now, the kind of military technology that it seeks for its programs. And that could be aiding its missile programs, its military satellite programs. And it makes it very difficult for democratic states to try to stop that when you've got major powers like China and Russia openly supporting North Korea.
Right. So, do you think, and do you have any suggestions on how to, further contain these advancements?
Sure. Diplomacy is a good start, and I think, let's start with the war in Ukraine. Maybe that will help open up some new doors with Russia. Clearly, President Trump is interested in engaging Xi Jinping. Maybe that'll open up some new prospects there for cooperation. We'll see. Let's make sure that South Korea gets an electoral mandate for its government so that we have a strong ally in Seoul coordinating with us and working with us on this diplomacy. And let's keep Japan engaged as well and actively supporting non-proliferation. All of these things will be steps in this year that could be strengthened.
Right, so combined diplomacy is the key. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your insights tonight. We will have to leave our discussion right here. Again, many thanks to Professor Myers and Dr. Cronin. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now, that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.